Okay, this is section 7.2, the cell membrane, and this is video 702. So outside of the cell membrane, many cells have what's called a cell wall. Now this cell wall is for protection and support, and it will also allow things to pass through it, usually like water, oxygen, carbon dioxide. The type of cells that have this cell wall are plants. I'd say almost all plant cells have a cell wall. Algae, fungi, and many prokaryotes or bacteria have cell walls. Now, inside of the cell wall is what's called the cell membrane. And before we talk about the cell membrane, I need to talk about water just for a minute. Now, a normal water molecule is made up of hydrogens, right? We got 2 hydrogens, right, and 2 oxygens, so H2O. And the way a water molecule is set up is you have oxygen here, and you have hydrogens covalently bonded to it. Well, since they're covalently bonded, what happens, since oxygen is such a big atom, it holds the electrons a little bit closer, giving it a slightly negative charge. And because the electrons are closer to the oxygen, that makes the hydrogen slightly positive. So the way that water molecules are set up is kind of like this. You have the other oxygen here. Okay, and then hydrogen might be there. Another hydrogen here. Okay, actually probably going down a little bit. So here would be your oxygen molecule. Okay, then your hydrogens would be down here. Okay. Now, if a molecule has a slightly negative charge and a slightly positive charge, it's called a polar molecule. Okay, so it has charged ends, and it will dissolve in water. Okay. Now, if a molecule is nonpolar, it's just the opposite. It does not have charged ends, and it won't dissolve in water. Okay? So keep that in mind as I talk about the cell membrane. So here's our cell membrane here, and the purpose of it is to regulate what goes in and what leaves the cell. It also protects and supports the cell as the cell wall did. Okay? Now, let's see. One of the names of the cell membrane is called the lipid bilayer, and that's what gives it a flexible structure and a strong barrier between the cell and its surroundings. So you see this word lipid. You know this word lipid, so you know that lipids are involved here. Remember, if you remember, one of the functions of lipids was cell membranes, being in cell membranes. Now, the lipid that's in a cell membrane is a little bit different than the lipids we talked about. We talked about the ones with fatty acid and glycerol. Well, these still have fatty acid chains. However, their glycerol actually has a phosphate in it. So if you look right here, there's a phosphate in that glycerol chain. And then the fatty acid, there's only 2 as opposed to 3. Now, one thing about this type of fatty acid is, or rather this phospholipid, is that you have an end that is polar, which is the phosphate part, and then the fatty acid tails are nonpolar. And if you remember, the fatty acids didn't mix in water, did they? Lipids didn't mix in water. Well, with this, part of it can, but the other part doesn't. The part that is that can't mix with water is called hydrophobic, and the part that can mix with water is called hydrophilic. So here we have our lipid bilayer again. Okay, so over here, since this part is hydrophilic, remember the heads are hydrophilic, these are the heads, the polar heads, this is where you would find water. Okay, and if this was inside the cell, there could be water here also. So if you notice that it's a bilayer, so it's 2 layers of the phospholipids. Now, like I said, you could find water on the outside. Inside here would not be any water. Not water. Alright? Because that's the hydrophobic part. So another name for the lipid bilayer sometimes is the fluid mosaic model. And that's because there's different things that are embedded in this layer. And if you look at this diagram that I gave you, you have your phospholipids that you guys know about. You also have glycoproteins. Oops, didn't mean to move that. You have glycoproteins. You have carbohydrates in there. You have transmembrane proteins, meaning that they go through the whole layer. Okay, so there's quite a few things in this lipid bilayer. So because things are floating in it, that's why scientists might call it a fluid mosaic. The things that float mainly are those proteins, those carbohydrates are in there. Some of these proteins form what are called channels or pumps, and they allow things to go through the membrane. So if you've got something that is hydrophilic, but it has to get through that hydrophobic region, well, you have these proteins that will take it through. So if you look here, you also have what's called cholesterol that are embedded in the membrane, and the cholesterol keep the fatty acid tails from sticking. Keeps them from sticking together. Remember, they are lipid, so you know how fats kind of stick together. Now this membrane is called semi-permeable because it lets some things across and it doesn't. So if something can go across that membrane, it's called permeable, able to permeate the membrane. And if it cannot go across the membrane, it's called impermeable. So what's the main function of the cell membrane? Do you remember? That's right. Regulate what goes in and out of the cell. And it also protects and supports the cell.